They called us reckless, primitive, a species that threw themselves into danger without thought or strategy. For 3 cycles, I watched human soldiers charge headfirst into battles that should have terrified them into surrender. I documented their apparent madness, their seemingly suicidal tactics, their complete disregard for calculated warfare. I was wrong about everything. What I witnessed wasn't madness. It was something far more terrifying. Something that explains why ancient civilizations across the galaxy have one universal warning carved into their most sacred texts. When the humans come running toward death, run the other way. This is the story of how I learned why the cosmos itself trembles when humanity goes to war. Dr. Zaxtera had spent 47 years studying warfare across 12 different star systems, but nothing had prepared her for watching humans fight. The Altarian xenobiologist adjusted her 6 eyes to focus on the tactical display, each lens filtering different spectrums of data as she observed the human military unit designated Alpha Company prepare for what appeared to be certain death. The battlefield stretched across the crystalline plains of Kepler, 442b, where the Vorthack hegemony had established what military analysts universally agreed was an impenetrable fortress. Energy shields hummed with power that could vaporize a starship. Automated defense turrets tracked movements with microsecond precision, and 30,000 elite Vorthack warriors waited behind barriers that had never been breached in 3 centuries of galactic warfare. Against this seemingly impossible obstacle, the Galactic Defense Coalition had assembled their response: 200 human soldiers, a handful of outdated vehicles, and weapons that most civilized species had retired decades ago. It was, by any rational calculation, a suicide mission disguised as a military operation. ZYXTRA's research partner, Commander Veltar of the Centaurian Strategic Institute, manipulated the holographic display with his 4 manipulator arms, zooming in on individual human faces. "Look at them," he said, his voice carrying the harmonic overtones that indicated deep concern among his species. "They show no signs of pre-combat stress, no elevated neurotransmitter activity, no fight or flight responses." The xenobiologist's specialty was understanding how different species processed fear and survival instincts. She had documented the behavioral patterns of over 300 sapient races, creating comprehensive profiles of how each approached combat situations. The Altarians, like her own species, relied on careful calculation and overwhelming technological advantage. The Centaurians favored defensive positions and attrition warfare. The Crethani used swarm tactics backed by numerical superiority. But humans appeared to have no coherent strategy at all. "Perhaps they don't understand the tactical situation," suggested Dr. Mordun, the 3rd member of their research team. The elderly Volcaran had witnessed the rise and fall of empires across the spiral arm, and his experience with military analysis was unquestioned. Their intelligence-gathering capabilities are primitive compared to standard galactic norms. ZYXTRA disagreed, pulling up the communication intercepts. Listen to their pre-battle briefing from 6 hours ago. The recorded voice of Colonel Sarah Martinez filled their observation chamber. The human officer spoke in the clipped, efficient tones that seemed universal among military leaders, regardless of species. "Intelligence confirms 30,000 hostiles behind Class 5 energy barriers. Automated defenses include particle beam arrays, kinetic bombardment systems, and molecular disruptor fields. Approach vectors are limited to a 2-kilometer corridor under constant surveillance. Expected casualty rate approaches 90%. A younger human voice responded. "So, it's Tuesday then, ma'am?" Laughter erupted from the human ranks. Actual laughter in the face of almost certain death. "You see," ZYXTRA gestured with 3 of her appendages. "They understand exactly what they're facing. This isn't ignorance. This is something else entirely." The research team had been embedded with human military units for 3 months, documenting their battlefield behavior for the Coalition's Xenopsychology Division. The official purpose was to understand how humanity had earned such a fearsome reputation despite being relative newcomers to galactic civilization. The unofficial purpose was to determine whether humans represented a threat to the established order of galactic society. So far, the evidence suggested they represented a threat to conventional understanding itself. Veltar highlighted tactical formations on the display. Observe their deployment pattern. No defensive positions. No fallback coordinates. No extraction plan. The human soldiers were arranging themselves in loose formations that emphasized mobility over protection. They carried weapons that prioritized rapid fire over precision, equipment that favored speed over armor, and supplies that suggested they expected the battle to be over quickly, one way or another. It violates every principle of rational warfare, More Dunn observed. Where are the preliminary bombardments? The electronic warfare? The psychological operations? Instead of the complex multi-phase operations that define modern military doctrine, the humans appear to be planning something that military academies across the galaxy would classify as an elementary tactical error, a direct frontal assault against prepared positions. HFY had reviewed the historical records. Human military history was filled with similar examples. At a place called Omaha Beach, they had charged across open ground against entrenched positions. At Thermopylae, they had stood against impossible odds. At Stalingrad, they had fought in conditions that should have broken any rational species' will to resist. The pattern was consistent. Humans encountered impossible situations and responded by running directly toward them. Ma'am, we're getting movement on the human perimeter. The observation team focused their instruments on the tactical display. Human soldiers were rising from their positions, checking weapons one final time, and beginning their advance toward the Vorthak fortress. No artillery preparation, no diversionary attacks, no complex maneuvering. They simply began walking toward 30,000 enemies. This is Dr. Zyexthera to Coalition Command. She spoke into her communication device. Human forces have initiated their assault. Recommend all observation platforms maintain maximum safe distance. Acknowledged. Are you certain you want to maintain close observation? We can provide full sensor data from the orbital platforms. ZYXTRA looked at her research partners. They had spent months trying to understand human behavior through analysis and theoretical frameworks. Perhaps direct observation of their most extreme behavior would provide the answers they sought. Negative command. We're staying. The human advance began slowly, almost casually. Soldiers moved in groups of 4 or 5, maintaining loose coordination, but nothing resembling the precise formations that military doctrine demanded. They talked among themselves as they walked, sharing jokes that their universal translators conveyed with surprising clarity. Hey, Rodriguez, remember that thing your grandmother used to say about walking into bad situations? Yeah, she said, Mijo, sometimes you gotta go through hell to get where you're going. Well, I can see the gates from here. More laughter. These beings were laughing as they approached what every rational calculation indicated would be their deaths. ZYXTRA began recording detailed behavioral observations. Human subjects display no indicators of fear response despite conscious awareness of extreme danger. Stress hormone levels remain within normal parameters. Social bonding behaviors actually appear strengthened by proximity to threat. The first energy discharges from the Vorthak fortress lit up the crystalline landscape. Particle beams capable of cutting through starship holes carved glowing trenches in the ground around the advancing humans. The automated defense systems had activated, creating a web of lethal energy that should have stopped any assault before it truly began. The humans began running, not away from the deadly light show, toward it. Fascinating, Veltar muttered, all 4 of his arms working frantically to adjust sensors. Their acceleration toward the threat appears to be directly proportional to the intensity of hostile fire. What followed challenged every assumption about rational behavior. As the Vorthak defenses intensified, human soldiers abandoned any pretense of cover or caution. They sprinted across open ground that was being systematically swept by weapons designed to annihilate entire formations. When barriers of energy blocked their path, they found ways around, under, or somehow through them. But it wasn't random or chaotic. Zawaxthara began to notice patterns in what had initially appeared to be madness. Commander Veltar, are you recording the micro-tactical adjustments? Yes, but I don't understand the logic. Neither had she initially, but as she watched, the seemingly reckless human advance began to reveal its underlying structure. Each group of soldiers was observing the others, learning from successes and failures in real time. When one team found a gap in the energy barriers, others immediately adapted their approach to exploit similar weaknesses. It wasn't that humans ignored danger, they processed it differently. Where other species saw obstacles to be overcome through careful planning, humans saw problems to be solved through direct action. They're innovating, she realized. In real time, under fire, they're developing new tactics. A human soldier named Thompson, according to the biometric tags her equipment tracked, dove under a particle beam that should have been impossible to predict, rolled to his feet, and immediately began laying down, covering fire for his teammates. Another soldier, Martinez, used the explosion from a kinetic bombardment round to mask her movement across 20 meters of open ground. They were improvising their way through a situation that should have required months of careful planning. Dr. Kayaxra, Mordunn's harmonic voice carried undertones of genuine alarm. I'm detecting massive energy buildup in the fortress central structure. The main Vorthak weapon was powering up. Intelligence reports had identified it as a plasma cannon capable of turning the entire battlefield into molten glass. It was the fortress's ultimate deterrent, a weapon so powerful that merely targeting it at an enemy force was usually sufficient to trigger immediate surrender. The human soldiers were still running toward it. Colonel Martinez's voice crackled across the communication channels. All units, looks like they're bringing out the big gun. Remember your training. Remember your brothers and sisters beside you. And remember that the folks back home are counting on us to get this done. Training seemed an inadequate word for what Zawaxthara was witnessing. This went beyond preparation or conditioning. This was something fundamental to human nature itself. The plasma cannon fired. A beam of energy that could have powered a small city for a year lanced across the battlefield, creating a trench of superheated plasma where moments before human soldiers had been advancing. The thermal bloom was visible from orbit, and the electromagnetic pulse disrupted several of the observation team's instruments. When the energy dissipated and their sensors came back online, Zawaxthara expected to see the end of the human assault. No rational species would continue in advance after facing a weapon of such devastating power. The humans were still running forward. More than that, they had used the plasma cannon's firing cycle to advance another 100 meters. While the weapon recharged, they had covered ground that should have been impossible to cross. Ow! Veltar's voice carried harmonics of disbelief that were physically painful for other Centaurians to hear. Zawaxthara was beginning to understand. Though she wasn't certain, she believed her own conclusions. They're not trying to survive this battle. I don't follow. Every tactical doctrine in the galaxy is based on the assumption that the primary goal is survival. Preserve forces, minimize casualties, achieve objectives with minimal risk. But look at their behavior patterns. She highlighted the human advance on the tactical display. They're not calculating survival probabilities. They're calculating mission success probabilities. The distinction is critical. While other species asked, how can we accomplish this objective while keeping our forces alive? Humans asked, how can we accomplish this objective? The difference seemed subtle, but its implications were staggering. They're willing to die, Mordunn observed. No, se te griega estará corrective. They're willing to die for each other. That's what makes them terrifying. As if to prove her point, a human soldier designated as Private Chun threw himself into the path of an incoming kinetic round to shield his teammates. The projectile, traveling at a significant fraction of light speed, should have been impossible to intercept. But Chun had calculated not its trajectory, but the trajectory of his own body needed to block it. He succeeded. His teammates continued their advance. Similar scenes played out across the battlefield. Humans didn't just fight as individuals who happened to be in the same unit. They fought as a single organism with multiple bodies. When one fell, others immediately adapted to fill the gap. When facing impossible odds, they found ways to create possibilities through sacrifice. The Vorthak fortress, designed to withstand conventional military assault, wasn't prepared for an enemy that treated its own survival as secondary to mission accomplishment. "They're inside the perimeter," Veltar announced. Somehow, impossibly, human soldiers had breached energy barriers that had protected the fortress for 3 centuries. They moved through defensive positions that should have been impregnable, not because they were invulnerable, but because they refused to be stopped by mere invulnerability. Zwyxtera realized she was witnessing something that would require her to revise decades of research on combat psychology. Humans didn't fight wars the way other species did. They fought them the way natural disasters happened, with an inevitability that transcended rational response. The plasma cannon fired again, this time at point-blank range against human soldiers who had somehow reached its base. The weapon that could annihilate armies struck targets that should have been vaporized instantly. When the energy cleared, the cannon was silent. Permanently. Dr. Zwyxtera to Coalition Command. Human forces have neutralized primary target. Fortress defenses are failing. Confirmed. What's her casualty rate? She checked the biometric readings. Nearly 60% of the human force was dead or critically injured. By any rational military standard, the unit should have ceased to function as an effective fighting force. Instead, the remaining humans were pressing their advantage, moving deeper into the fortress complex with the same terrifying determination that had carried them across the killing ground. Casualties are acceptable to them, apparently. As she watched the conclusion of what military historians would undoubtedly classify as an impossible victory, Zwyxtera began to understand why ancient civilizations across the galaxy had left warnings about humanity. It wasn't their technology or their numbers that made them dangerous. It was their complete willingness to pay any price for victory. "Command, I need to revise my preliminary report." "Go ahead, Doctor." Zwyxtera looked at the tactical display, where human soldiers were systematically dismantling defenses that had protected the Vorthak hegemony for generations. Humans don't rush into battle because they're reckless or primitive. They rush into battle because they've already decided the outcome is worth dying for. And when beings are willing to die for something, they become capable of achieving the impossible. She paused, watching as the last Vorthak defensive positions fell to soldiers who should have been dead hours ago. "I recommend immediate revision of all human threat assessments. We've been measuring them by the wrong standards entirely." 3 days after the impossible victory at the Vorthak fortress, Dr. Zwyxtera found herself in the medical bay of the human carrier ship Indomitable, studying something that challenged her understanding of biology itself. Private First Class Maria Santos lay in a regeneration pod, her body healing from injuries that should have killed any known sapient species twice over. "She took a direct hit from a molecular disruptor," explained Dr. James Harrison, the human chief medical officer. His voice carried the exhausted satisfaction of someone who had just pulled off medical miracles for 3 straight days. The weapon literally tore apart her cellular structure at the quantum level. By rights, she should have simply stopped existing. Zwyxtera's medical scanners confirmed what her eyes refused to believe. Santos was not only alive, but healing at a rate that defied every biological model in her extensive database. How is this possible? Dr. Harrison pulled up holographic displays of Santos's cellular activity. "That's what we're trying to figure out." Her quantum signature should have been scrambled beyond any possibility of recovery. But somehow, her body remembered its proper configuration and just rebuilt itself. The xenobiologist had spent the last 72 hours interviewing surviving humans from the fortress assault, trying to understand the psychological mechanisms that had enabled their impossible victory. What she had discovered was far more unsettling than simple courage or determination. "Dr. Harrison, May I ask you a personal question? Shoot. The casual human expression for proceed still startled her, given their recent battlefield context. When you joined the military medical corps, did you expect to treat injuries like this? Harrison laughed, but it wasn't the same laughter she had heard on the battlefield. This carried undertones of something she was beginning to recognize as uniquely human. The ability to find humor in situations that should inspire only horror. Dr. Zaxara, I joined the medical corps expecting to patch up training accidents and maybe deal with the occasional space flu outbreak. That was before we discovered that humans don't just fight wars. We personally insult the laws of physics while we're doing it. She had reviewed the medical records from human military conflicts across the galaxy. The pattern was consistent and impossible. Humans routinely survived injuries that would kill members of any other species, recovered from conditions that had no known treatments, and returned to active duty from situations that should have resulted in permanent disability or death. Is it genetic? Some evolutionary adaptation? That's the thing, Harrison said, pulling up comparative analyses. Our baseline physiology isn't significantly different from other humanoid species. We're not tougher than Altarians, not faster than Crethani, not smarter than Vulcarans. By every measurable standard, we should be thoroughly average. But you're not. No, we're really not. The medical data painted a picture that violated fundamental biological principles. Human soldiers in combat conditions showed enhanced healing rates, improved immune responses, and cellular regeneration capabilities that emerged only under extreme stress. It was as if the act of fighting for something important caused their bodies to transcend normal limitations. Doctor, I need to ask about the psychological profiles of your species. Harrison gestured toward a chair designed for humanoid physiology. Have a seat. This might take a while. Zawaixthara arranged her appendages in the approximation of sitting and activated her recording devices. My research indicates that humans process fear differently than other sapient species. How so? Most species experience fear as an inhibiting emotion. It triggers careful analysis, risk assessment, and self-preservation behaviors. But humans seem to experience fear as motivation. Harrison nodded slowly. That's not inaccurate. We have a saying, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite being terrified. But that's irrational. Is it? Fear tells us something is dangerous. But danger doesn't automatically mean we should avoid it. Sometimes danger means we're going in the right direction. The concept violated every evolutionary model Zawaixthara had studied. Fear responses had evolved to keep organisms alive, not to drive them toward greater risks. Yet human civilization seemed built around the principle that some things were worth facing any danger to achieve. Can you explain the human concept of sacrifice? Dr. Harrison was quiet for several minutes, staring at the medical displays showing Private Santos's impossible recovery. Dr. Zawaixthara, do you have children? My species reproduces through communal spawning. We don't form individual parental attachments. Right. Well, humans do. We form bonds that transcend individual survival instincts. Parent to child, soldier to unit, citizen to society. When those bonds are threatened, we stop thinking about personal survival and start thinking about protecting what matters. But Private Santos doesn't have children in this unit. No, but she has family, brothers and sisters who chose each other instead of being born to each other. That's what a military unit becomes, a family that fights. Zawaixthara pulled up the psychological profile she had compiled. During the fortress assault, I observed humans making decisions that prioritized group survival over individual survival. But it went beyond rational tactical choice. They seem to find strength in sacrifice itself. Because sacrifice isn't weakness for us, it's power. I don't understand. Harrison stood and walked to the viewing port that looked out at the stars. When a human decides something is worth dying for, they stop being limited by their own mortality. They become capable of things that immortal beings can't achieve because immortal beings always have something to lose. The implications were staggering. HFY had studied hundreds of species that had achieved interstellar civilization. All of them were rational, cautious, careful to preserve their accumulated knowledge and resources. None of them were willing to risk everything for abstract principles. Is this why humans have such an impact on galactic civilization despite being newcomers? Partly, but it's more than just military capability. Harrison activated a holographic display showing human settlements across dozens of star systems. Look at our colonies. We don't just establish safe, sustainable communities. We terraform hostile worlds, build cities in impossible environments, and create thriving civilizations in places that other species write off as uninhabitable. The data supported his claim. Human settlements existed on worlds with crushing gravity, toxic atmospheres, extreme radiation, and geological instability. Planets that other species used only for automated mining or research stations hosted thriving human communities. We don't see obstacles. We see puzzles to solve, and we're willing to pay any price to solve them. A soft chime indicated that Private Santos was regaining consciousness. Dr. Harrison moved to her regeneration pod, checking vital signs that continued to defy medical understanding. Santos, how are you feeling? The young soldier's voice was weak but determined. Like I got hit by a molecular disruptor, sir. But I'm ready to get back to my unit. You're going to need at least another week of regeneration therapy. With respect, sir, my team is still out there. They need me. HFY observed the exchange with growing understanding. Santos had sustained injuries that should have killed her, had survived through impossible biological processes, and her primary concern was returning to face similar dangers again. Private Santos, she interjected. May I ask you a question? Sure, ma'am. When you charged the Vorthack Fortress, what were you thinking? Santos was quiet for a moment, her expression serious. I was thinking about my little sister back on Earth. She's 8 years old, and she still believes that her big sister can protect her from anything. I was thinking about my team and how we trained together for 2 years. I was thinking about all the people across the galaxy who are counting on us to stop the Vorthack from expanding their empire. But weren't you afraid of dying? Terrified, Santos admitted. But being afraid of dying and being willing to die aren't contradictory. I was scared, but I was more scared of letting people down. Dr. Harrison checked Santos's cellular regeneration rates and frowned at the display. This is impossible. She's healing faster now than when she was unconscious. Why? HFY asked. Because she's awake and thinking about her purpose again. Human bodies respond to psychological state in ways we don't fully understand. When we have something to fight for, we become harder to kill. HFY was beginning to understand why ancient galactic civilizations had feared humanity long before humans achieved spaceflight. It wasn't their technology or their tactics that made them dangerous. It was their complete inability to accept that some things were impossible. Private Santos, what would you have done if the fortress assault had failed? Found another way, ma'am. Humans don't really have a concept of impossible. Just hasn't been figured out yet. The casual certainty in her voice was more unsettling than any display of aggression could have been. This wasn't arrogance or ignorance. It was fundamental belief that any problem could be solved if someone was willing to pay the price. Dr. Harrison, I need to understand something about human evolution. What specifically? How did a species develop that views personal survival as negotiable? Harrison considered the question while monitoring Santos's continued impossible recovery. We didn't evolve as individuals, Dr. HFY. We evolved as communities. Our survival strategy was never keep yourself alive. It was keep the group alive. That means sometimes individuals have to take risks that sacrifice personal survival for group benefit. But that should have been selected against by evolutionary pressure. Should have been. But it wasn't because groups with individuals willing to sacrifice for the community outcompete groups of pure individualists. We didn't evolve to be the toughest or the smartest. We evolved to be the most willing to die for each other. So Waxter reviewed the footage from the Fortress assault again, this time focusing on the micro-decisions that individual humans made under extreme pressure. Every choice, every action, every sacrifice had been made with the group's success as the primary consideration. This explains the tactical innovations we observed during the battle. How so? Other species develop tactics through careful analysis and testing. But humans develop tactics through trial and error in real combat situations because you're willing to accept the casualties that come with trial and error. Dr. Harrison nodded grimly. That's not inaccurate. We learn by doing, even when doing might kill us. Especially when doing might kill us, because high stakes force rapid adaptation. A communication alert interrupted their discussion. Colonel Martinez's voice filled the medical bay. All hands, prepare for immediate departure. Intelligence indicates Vorthack reinforcements are en route to retake the fortress. Private Santos immediately began removing herself from the regeneration pod, despite her injuries. Sir, I need to get back to my unit. Santos, you're in no condition for combat. With respect, Dr. Harrison, I'm in better condition for combat than any other species would be after total cellular disruption. And my team needs me. Zoexaral watched the injured human soldier prepare to return to battle. Her body still healing from injuries that should have been fatal. Her mind focused not on her own condition, but on her responsibilities to others. Dr. Harrison, I'm beginning to understand something that my research missed. What's that? Humans don't rush into battle because you're reckless. You rush into battle because you've already decided that some things are more important than individual survival. And once that decision is made, you become capable of achieving things that purely rational beings cannot. Private Santos paused in her preparations and looked at the xenobiologist. Ma'am, if I may ask, what happens when your species faces impossible odds? We analyze the situation, assess our capabilities, and develop strategic responses that maximize survival probability. And if the analysis shows that survival is impossible, Zwaxtera hesitated. We negotiate, or withdraw, or accept defeat. See, that's where we're different, Santos said, pulling on her combat gear despite her recent injuries. When humans face impossible odds, we get creative, because for us, impossible just means nobody's figured out how yet. As Zwaxtera watched Private Santos walk back toward what would undoubtedly be another impossible battle, she realized that her research had been asking the wrong questions. She had been trying to understand human military effectiveness through conventional frameworks of tactics, technology, and training. But humans weren't effective in spite of their willingness to die. They were effective because of it. When survival was no longer the limiting factor, they became capable of things that survival-focused beings could never achieve. The cosmos trembled when humans went to war not because they were the strongest or the smartest or the best equipped. It trembled because they were the only species that had weaponized hope itself. The unshakable belief that any sacrifice was worthwhile if it served something greater than individual existence. As the medical bay emptied and the ship prepared for another impossible battle, Zwaxtera began composing her preliminary report to the Galactic Science Council. Her findings would require a fundamental revision of their understanding of what made a species dangerous. Humans weren't dangerous because they were willing to fight. They were dangerous because they were willing to die. And beings who had transcended the fear of death were capable of literally anything. Supreme Commander Kethvar had conquered 17 star systems during his 400-year military career, but as he watched the impossible advance of human forces across the monitoring screens of his command bunker, he felt something he had never experienced in combat: genuine confusion. The humans had no right to still be alive. His fortress had been designed by the greatest military architects of the Vorthack hegemony, incorporating defensive technologies that had remained unbreached for over 3 centuries. The automated defense grid alone was capable of simultaneously tracking and eliminating 10,000 individual targets. The energy barriers could deflect the focused output of a stellar core. The kinetic bombardment systems could shatter entire mountains. Yet somehow, a force of 200 primitive humans had not only breached these defenses, but was currently advancing through the fortress interior as if the supposedly impregnable barriers were mere inconveniences. Status report, he demanded, his 6-foot frame towering over the tactical display that showed red indicators throughout the fortress complex. Subcommander Vexhal, whose own military record spanned 2 centuries of successful campaigns, manipulated the holographic controls with his 4 primary arms while his secondary limbs tracked multiple data streams. Sir, outer perimeter defenses have been completely neutralized. Energy barrier generators in sections 7 through 15 have been destroyed or disabled. The plasma cannon is offline. How many human casualties? Approximately 60% of their initial force. Kethvar's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. Those were devastating losses by any rational military standard. Then, they'll be withdrawing to preserve their remaining forces. No, sir. They're advancing deeper into the fortress complex. The Supreme Commander's satisfaction turned to bewilderment. A military force that had sustained 60% casualties should be combat ineffective, either retreating to regroup or surrendering to preserve what remained of their unit. Yet the tactical display showed human forces moving through his fortress with the same determined advance that had carried them across the killing fields outside. Show me the battle recordings from the outer perimeter. The holographic display shifted to show footage from the fortress's external sensors. Kethvar had reviewed countless battle recordings during his long career, but what he saw challenged his understanding of warfare itself. Human soldiers had charged directly into withering defensive fire that should have stopped any assault within the first few seconds. But instead of being deterred by casualties, they had seemed to find motivation in them. When their comrades fell, the survivors had accelerated their advance rather than seeking cover. Pause the recording at Mark 774. The display froze on an image that would haunt Kethvar for the rest of his existence. A human soldier designated as Sergeant Thompson was diving through a gap in the energy barriers while simultaneously providing covering fire for his teammates. The soldier had already sustained injuries that should have incapacitated any Vorthak warrior, yet his combat effectiveness appeared undiminished. Resume recording. What followed violated every principle of tactical doctrine that Kethvar had studied during his centuries of military education. When the plasma cannon had fired its first devastating shot, creating a trench of superheated destruction across the battlefield, the human response had been to use the weapon's firing cycle as an opportunity to advance closer to the fortress. They had turned his most powerful defensive weapon into a tactical advantage for their assault. Subcommander, call up the psychological profiles of human military personnel from our intelligence database. Vexhal's secondary limbs worked the controls while his primary arms continued monitoring the current tactical situation. Sir, intelligence reports indicate that human military psychology is difficult to categorize. Explain. They appear to operate under the assumption that individual survival is less important than mission completion. This creates behavioral patterns that don't match standard psychological models for any known sapient species. Kethvar had commanded forces from dozens of different species during his career. Altarians were methodical and careful. Centaurians favored defensive positions and overwhelming firepower. Crethani relied on numerical superiority and swarm tactics. Each species had predictable behavioral patterns that could be countered through appropriate tactical responses. But humans? Humans appeared to have no consistent pattern except an absolute refusal to accept defeat. Sir, we're receiving a communication from the human forces. Audio only? No, sir. They're requesting a direct video conference. The audacity was staggering. Human soldiers were fighting through his fortress, sustaining catastrophic casualties, facing impossible odds, and they wanted to have a conversation. Patch it through. The holographic display shifted to show a human female in combat gear that bore clear signs of recent battle damage. Blood traced lines across her face, and her uniform showed scorch marks from energy weapons. Yet her expression showed no signs of fear or desperation. Supreme Commander Ketvar, I presume. I am. You're speaking to Colonel Martinez of the human forces currently dying in my fortress. The human's response was not what he expected. She smiled, an expression that among humans indicated amusement or satisfaction rather than submission. That's where you're wrong, Commander. We're not dying in your fortress. We're living in it very aggressively. Kethvar checked the tactical display again. Human forces had penetrated deeper into the fortress complex, reaching areas that had been considered absolutely secure. They had disabled defensive systems that had protected the facility for centuries, overcome obstacles that should have required specialized equipment, and weeks of preparation. Colonel Martinez, your forces have sustained unacceptable casualties. By any rational calculation, you should withdraw immediately. Commander, can I share something with you about human psychology? The casual tone was more unsettling than any display of aggression could have been. This was a being who was conducting a diplomatic conversation while her soldiers fought and died throughout his fortress. Proceed. Humans don't calculate acceptable casualty rates the same way other species do. For most beings, casualties represent losses to be minimized. For humans, casualties represent investments in achieving something important. That's irrational. Is it? Commander, how long did it take you to build this fortress? 47 years of construction, drawing on 3 centuries of defensive innovation. And how long have humans been fighting to breach it? Kethvar checked his chronometer. 4 hours and 37 minutes. Exactly. You spent centuries building something to last forever. We spent 4 hours proving that nothing lasts forever. Which approach is actually more rational? The question was deeply disturbing because it suggested that human military doctrine operated on fundamentally different assumptions about the nature of warfare itself. Vorthack strategy was based on building unbreakable defenses and overwhelming force projection. Human strategy appeared to be based on the assumption that anything built could be broken if someone was willing to pay the price. Colonel, what do you hope to achieve? Even if you capture this fortress, the hegemony will respond with overwhelming force. You cannot possibly hold what you've taken. Commander, you're thinking like a Vorthack. We're not trying to hold the fortress. Then what are you doing? We're proving a point. The communication channel carried sounds of ongoing battle. Energy weapons firing, explosions, the distinctive crack of human kinetic weapons. Yet Colonel Martinez continued their conversation as if discussing routine matters. What point? That the Vorthack hegemony is not invincible. That your defenses can be breached. That your reputation for being unbeatable was built on fighting species that value individual survival above mission accomplishment. Kethvar felt something that might have been the beginning of fear. You're using this assault as a demonstration. Exactly. Every species in the galaxy believes that Vorthack fortresses cannot be taken by direct assault. After today, they'll know differently. At the cost of your entire force. Commander, let me explain something about human military thinking. We don't measure success by how many of us survive. We measure success by whether the mission is accomplished. And our mission here isn't to capture your fortress. It's to show the galaxy that it can be done. The tactical display showed human forces reaching the fortress command levels. They had fought through defensive positions that should have stopped armies, overcome obstacles that had been designed to be literally insurmountable, and maintained combat effectiveness despite losses that would have broken any other species will to fight. Sir, Subcommander Vexhal interrupted. Human forces have breached the primary command center. They're approximately 6 minutes from reaching this position. Kethvar looked at the communication display, where Colonel Martinez continued to regard him with that unsettling human expression of calm satisfaction. Colonel, your soldiers are going to die here. Some of them, yes. But, Commander, that's not the point. The point is that we'll have proven that Vorthack fortresses can be taken. And once that knowledge spreads across the galaxy, Every species that you've intimidated with your reputation for invincibility will know that they have options. You're sacrificing your entire force for psychological warfare. We're investing our lives in something more important than our individual survival. That's the difference between humans and everyone else. We understand that some things are worth dying for. An explosion echoed through the command bunker as human forces breached the final defensive barriers. Kethvar could hear the distinctive sound of human weapons moving closer to his position. Sir, recommend immediate evacuation to the secondary command center. Kethvar continued to stare at Colonel Martinez's image. Colonel, you've accomplished your objective. Your point has been made. Will you accept an honorable surrender? Commander, I appreciate the offer, but we're not here to surrender. We're here to complete the mission, which is total neutralization of Vorthak offensive capabilities in this system. The implications were staggering. The humans weren't content with merely proving that the fortress could be breached. They intended to completely destroy the hegemony's military presence in the system. That's impossible. Even if you somehow manage to capture this facility, we have orbital defense platforms, support fleets, and ground installations across 3 planets. Commander, you keep using that word. Impossible. It doesn't mean what you think it means when you're talking about humans. The sound of human weapons was now audible outside the command center doors. Soldiers who should have been dead hours ago were about to capture a facility that had never been taken by direct assault. Sir, we need to evacuate immediately. Kethvar made a decision that would haunt him for the remainder of his career. Instead of evacuating, he opened the command center doors and walked out to meet the approaching human forces. What he saw challenged his understanding of biology itself. Human soldiers who had sustained injuries that should have killed them were still fighting with lethal effectiveness. They moved through the fortress with the kind of tactical precision that should have required months of specific training for this facility, yet they were obviously improvising their approach in real time. The lead human soldier, a young female whose biotags identified her as Private Santos, lowered her weapon when she saw him. Supreme Commander Kethvar, I presume. I am. Your Private Santos, according to our bioscanner readings. Your medical profile indicates you should have died approximately 43 minutes ago. Santos smiled with the same unsettling expression he had seen from Colonel Martinez. Sir, human medical profiles don't account for what happens when we have something important to fight for, such as each other, our families back home. The idea that bullies shouldn't be allowed to terrorize people just because they're stronger. Kethvar looked at the human soldiers surrounding him. Each showed signs of injuries that should have been incapacitating, yet they maintained full combat readiness. Their weapons remained trained on him, but their expressions showed no hatred or aggression, merely professional determination. What happens now? Now, sir, you're going to help us send a message to the hegemony. What message? Private Santos activated a communication device. That humans don't negotiate with bullies. We just remove them. As Kethvar stood in his captured fortress, surrounded by soldiers who had achieved the impossible through sheer refusal to accept defeat, he began to understand why ancient galactic civilizations had left warnings about humanity. It wasn't their technology that made them dangerous. It wasn't their tactics or their training or their equipment. It was their absolute certainty that any sacrifice was worthwhile if it served something greater than themselves. And beings who had weaponized selflessness were capable of accomplishments that purely rational civilizations could never achieve. The fortress that had stood unbreached for 3 centuries had fallen in less than 5 hours, not because human weapons were superior, but because humans were willing to pay prices that no rational species would consider acceptable. As he prepared to send a surrender message to the hegemony command structure, Kethvar realized that this battle would mark the beginning of the end of Vorthak military dominance in the galaxy. Not because humans were unbeatable, but because they had proved that the supposedly unbeatable could be beaten by anyone willing to pay the price. And once that knowledge spread across the stars, The hegemony's reign of intimidation would crumble like the walls of his supposedly impregnable fortress. Ambassador Trembles had presided over the Galactic Council for 67 years, mediating disputes between civilizations that spanned thousands of star systems. In her extensive experience, she had learned that most conflicts followed predictable patterns: initial aggression, diplomatic posturing, negotiated settlements, and carefully managed enforcement of agreements. The human situation was destroying all of those patterns. The reports must be exaggerated, insisted Representative Zorthal of the Centaurian Federation, his harmonic voice carrying overtones of deep skepticism. No military force could achieve what these documents claim without technological advantages that our intelligence services would have detected. The emergency council session had been called within hours of receiving initial reports from the Vortex system. Around the vast amphitheater that housed representatives from 47 different species, holographic displays showed the impossible aftermath of the human assault on what had been the hegemony's most secure military installation. The footage has been verified by 17 independent analysis teams. Ambassador Trembles replied, her crystalline voice resonating through the chamber's acoustic enhancement systems. The humans achieved total neutralization of Vortex defensive capabilities using conventional weapons and tactics that any species in this chamber could have employed. Then, why didn't any of us employ them? Asked Consul Merithak of the Crethani Collective, her insectoid features reflecting confusion through subtle color changes in her carapace. The question hung in the chamber's rarefied atmosphere, like an accusation against the fundamental assumptions that had governed galactic civilization for millennia. The Vortex hegemony's military dominance had been accepted as a fact of existence, like stellar mechanics or quantum physics. Their fortresses were unbreachable. Their fleets were invincible. Their expansion was inevitable. Until 200 human soldiers had decided otherwise. Dr. Vexera stepped forward to address the assembly, her research findings having been transmitted to every member species within hours of the battle's conclusion. Honored representatives, the answer to Consul Merithak's question lies in understanding the fundamental difference between human psychology and that of every other sapient species we've encountered. She activated the chamber's central holographic display, showing detailed analysis of human behavioral patterns during combat operations. Humans operate under the assumption that individual survival is negotiable in service of larger objectives. This creates tactical possibilities that survival-focused species simply cannot access. Representative Kexhai of the Volcaran Republic raised one of his 4 hands to request recognition. Dr. Vexera, your research suggests that humans are essentially suicidal. How does this explain their remarkable expansion across the galaxy? With respect, Representative Kexhai, humans are not suicidal. They are selectively mortal. They distinguish between situations where individual survival serves their objectives and situations where individual sacrifice serves those objectives more effectively. The distinction was crucial, and its implications were revolutionizing galactic understanding of what made a civilization dangerous. Species that prioritize survival above all else could be deterred through sufficient displays of force. But beings who viewed their own mortality as a tactical resource could not be deterred. They could only be destroyed completely or accommodated entirely. Show them the economic projections, requested Ambassador Trembles. The holographic display shifted to show trade routes, resource flows, and economic indicators from systems with human presence. The data painted a picture that was almost as unsettling as their military capabilities. Human colonies show productivity rates that exceed galactic averages by factors ranging from 300 to 800%, Dr. Zawakthara explained. They establish thriving civilizations on worlds that other species classify as uninhabitable. They undertake engineering projects that we consider impossible. Consul Merithak's carapace shifted to colors indicating deep concern. Ow! For the same reason they achieve impossible military victories. They approach problems from the perspective of what needs to be done rather than what can be safely attempted. When survival is not the limiting factor, the range of possible solutions expands dramatically. The chamber erupted in harmonic discussions as representatives communicated with their home governments. The implications of human psychology extended far beyond military considerations. If beings were willing to sacrifice individual safety for group advancement, they could undertake projects and accept risks that would advance their civilization at unprecedented rates. Representative Zorthal's harmonic tones carried deep alarm. Are we facing a species that will simply outcompete us through reckless expansion? Worse than that, Dr. HFY replied. We're facing a species that doesn't recognize the concept of insurmountable obstacles. Where we see fundamental limitations, they see engineering challenges. Ambassador HFY had reviewed the reports from human settlements across the galaxy. They had terraformed worlds with toxic atmospheres, built cities in the coronas of stars, and established thriving communities in the gravitational chaos around black holes. Projects that other civilizations had studied for centuries as theoretical possibilities, humans had completed within decades of first encountering the challenges. Dr. HFY, what are your recommendations for managing human expansion? The xenobiologist's response would reshape galactic policy for generations to come. Honored representatives, we cannot manage human expansion through traditional diplomatic means. Humans do not respond to threats, intimidation, or deterrence the way other species do. They respond to challenges by finding ways to overcome them. Then, how do we coexist with a species that refuses to accept limitations? By recognizing that traditional concepts of limitation may be artificial constructs rather than natural laws. The statement sent ripples of harmonic alarm throughout the chamber. Galactic civilization had been built on careful risk assessment, gradual expansion, and respect for natural boundaries. Human psychology suggested that many of those boundaries existed only in the minds of species that prioritize survival over achievement. Are you suggesting we adopt human approaches to problem solving? Representative Kexhai asked. I'm suggesting we acknowledge that human approaches work. The fortress that fell yesterday had protected Vorthak interests for 3 centuries. Human forces neutralized it in 5 hours using tactics that any species could have employed, but none of us were willing to pay the price those tactics required. Ambassador HFY activated communication channels to the Vorthak hegemony, whose surrender had been received just hours earlier. The Supreme Commander's image appeared in the chamber's display, his mandibles showing signs of what Vorthak psychology experts identified as profound philosophical confusion. Supreme Commander Kethvar, please share your assessment of human military capabilities. Honored Ambassador, human military capabilities cannot be measured by conventional standards. They do not fight wars, they fight for principles. And beings who fight for principles are capable of achieving things that beings who fight for survival cannot imagine. Can you elaborate? My fortress was designed to withstand any conceivable assault by rational opponents. But humans are not rational opponents. They are moral opponents. They fight not because they must, but because they believe their cause justifies any sacrifice. Consul Merithak's carapace displayed colors of incredulity. Supreme Commander, are you saying that human military effectiveness is based on belief systems rather than technology? Consul, I'm saying that human belief systems have become their most powerful technology. When beings believe something is worth dying for, they become capable of accomplishing what beings who merely want to live cannot achieve. The philosophical implications were staggering. Galactic civilization had been built on the assumption that rational self-interest was the highest form of motivation. Species advanced by carefully balancing risks and benefits, expanding only when safety could be reasonably assured, undertaking projects only when success probabilities were favorable. But humans had weaponized irrationality itself, the willingness to pursue objectives regardless of personal cost. And that willingness was producing results that rational calculation suggested should be impossible. Dr. HFY, What are the long-term implications of human expansion for galactic civilization? Honored representatives, humans will continue to achieve things we consider impossible until we stop considering them impossible. They will solve problems we believe are unsolvable until we stop believing they are unsolvable. They will overcome obstacles we think are insurmountable until we stop thinking they're insurmountable. Representative Zorthal's harmonic tones carried notes of existential alarm. Are you saying that human psychology could force evolution in our own approaches to challenges? I'm saying that human psychology is already forcing that evolution. The fortress that fell yesterday was supposed to be unbreachable. Now, every species in the galaxy knows it wasn't. The assumption of Vorthack invincibility that has shaped our foreign policy for centuries has been revealed as a myth. But at what cost? The human casualties were enormous. Were they? Let's examine the broader context. Dr. Zoyextera activated displays showing the strategic situation across the galaxy. The Vorthack hegemony had been expanding aggressively for 2 centuries, conquering or intimidating dozens of species. Their advance appeared unstoppable because no rational species was willing to pay the price necessary to stop them. Until the humans arrived. Exactly. And now, instead of continued Vorthack expansion threatening hundreds of billions of beings across dozens of systems, we have a demonstration that the supposedly unstoppable can be stopped by anyone willing to make the necessary sacrifices. Ambassador HFY realized that the Emergency Council was witnessing a fundamental shift in galactic civilization. For millennia, progress had been measured by how safely and efficiently objectives could be achieved. Human psychology suggested that the most important objectives could only be achieved by accepting danger and inefficiency as necessary costs. Supreme Commander Kethvar, what is the current status of Vorthack military operations? Honored Ambassador, the hegemony is conducting a complete strategic review of our expansion policies. The loss of our primary fortress has implications for our understanding of what constitutes defensible positions. Meaning that if humans can breach our strongest defenses, then our defenses are not actually strong enough. We are reassessing whether military expansion serves our long-term interests. The implications rippled across the chamber as representatives realized what they were witnessing. The Vorthack hegemony, which had been the galaxy's primary military threat for 2 centuries, was reconsidering aggressive expansion because a single human assault had proved their invincibility was an illusion. Dr. Zoyextera, are humans likely to continue this pattern of military intervention? Based on my research, humans will intervene wherever they perceive injustice that they have the capability to address. Their willingness to sacrifice for abstract principles means they will continue to take actions that other species consider strategically irrational, such as protecting civilizations that cannot protect themselves, such as challenging powers that abuse their strength, such as proving that things other species consider impossible are merely difficult. Consul Merthak's carapace displayed colors indicating deep philosophical contemplation. Are we witnessing the emergence of a species that will reshape galactic civilization through moral rather than technological advancement? We are witnessing the emergence of a species that has weaponized morality itself, and that weapon appears to be more effective than any technology we have previously encountered. As the Emergency Council session continued through the galactic night cycle, Ambassador HFY realized that the reports from the Vorthack system represented more than a military victory. They represented proof that the fundamental assumptions governing galactic civilization might need to be reconsidered. If humans could achieve the impossible through willingness to sacrifice, then perhaps the impossible was only impossible for species that were unwilling to pay the necessary price. And if that was true, then the cosmos itself might need to make room for beings who refuse to accept that anything was truly impossible. The session concluded with a unanimous resolution to establish formal diplomatic relations with humanity and to begin comprehensive studies of how human psychology might offer solutions to challenges that had puzzled galactic civilization for millennia. But as representatives departed for their home systems, many carried the unsettling knowledge that they had just witnessed the beginning of a new era, one in which the boundaries between possible and impossible would be redrawn by beings who had weaponized hope itself. 6 months after the fall of the Vorthak fortress, Dr. Athara stood before the assembled delegates of the First Galactic Conference on Human Psychology, holding in her manipulator appendages a report that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of interstellar civilization. The venue itself was symbolic of humanity's growing influence. Instead of the sterile perfection of traditional galactic conference facilities, the meeting was being held aboard the human research vessel Breakthrough, a ship that had been constructed in the impossible environment of a stellar corona and now served as a mobile laboratory for projects that other species considered theoretically fascinating but practically unachievable. "Honored delegates," she began, her crystalline voice carrying through the ship's acoustic systems. "After 6 months of intensive study, we have reached conclusions that require us to revise our fundamental understanding of what makes a species dangerous, what makes them valuable, and what makes them truly alien." Around the conference chamber, representatives from 63 different species waited for findings that their home governments desperately needed. The human expansion had accelerated beyond all projections. Colonies were being established on worlds that had been written off as uninhabitable. Engineering projects were being completed that violated conventional understanding of what was possible. Trade routes were being pioneered through regions of space that had been considered permanently inaccessible. And, most disturbing of all, other species were beginning to adopt human approaches to problem solving. Dr. Alexra interrupted Ambassador Veltorin of the Altarian Confederation. "Before you proceed with your findings, can you address the reports that human psychological patterns are proving contagious?" The question touched on the most unsettling development of the past 6 months. Species that had maintained stable, rational approaches to expansion and development for millennia were suddenly undertaking projects that involved previously unacceptable levels of risk. The Centaurian Federation had announced plans to establish colonies in active war zones. The Crethani Collective was attempting to terraform worlds that had been considered permanently hostile to life. Ambassador Veltorin, that question goes to the heart of our findings. Humans are not just psychologically different. They represent a form of consciousness that challenges the assumptions underlying galactic civilization itself. Dr. ZYXTRA activated the chamber's holographic display, showing brain scans from hundreds of different species. The neural patterns were remarkably similar across all sapient races, showing the characteristic structures that prioritize survival, risk assessment, and resource preservation. Except for humans. "Observe the differences in neural architecture," she continued, highlighting the uniquely human brain patterns. Where other species show enhanced development in regions associated with threat assessment and self-preservation, humans show enhanced development in regions associated with abstract thinking, long-term planning, and what can only be described as motivational override systems. "Motivational override," asked Representative Zorathol, his harmonic tones carrying notes of confusion. "The ability to suppress survival instincts in service of principles or objectives that exist only as concepts. Humans can choose to die for ideas that have no physical existence. Justice, freedom, the welfare of beings they have never met." The implications have been apparent within weeks of beginning detailed psychological studies. Human volunteers had consistently demonstrated the ability to overcome fundamental biological programming when they believed doing so served important purposes. Pain responses could be suppressed, fear reactions could be redirected, and survival instincts could be completely overridden by conscious decision. "Dr. Vexera, are you saying that humans are biologically capable of transcending their own biology?" "I'm saying that humans have evolved a form of consciousness that treats biology as a set of guidelines rather than absolute constraints. The research had been conducted in cooperation with human scientists, and their casual attitude toward their own remarkable capabilities had been almost as unsettling as the capabilities themselves. When presented with evidence that they could achieve things that other species considered biologically impossible, humans had typically responded with variations of, "Yeah, we figured that out a while ago." Captain Sarah Chun of the Breakthrough joined the presentation, her presence representing the human perspective on the research findings. "Delegates, if I may address Dr. ZYX's findings from our perspective." "Please proceed, Captain." "You're trying to understand human psychology by comparing it to other species, but that might be the wrong approach. Humans didn't evolve to be like other species. We evolved to be human." Ambassador Veltorin's optical sensors focused intently on the human officer. "Can you elaborate?" "Every species in this chamber evolved survival strategies based on avoiding danger, minimizing risk, and preserving resources. But humans evolved in an environment where the greatest dangers couldn't be avoided through caution. They had to be confronted directly." Captain Shin activated additional displays showing Earth's geological and biological history. "Our homeworld tried to kill us with ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, and predators that were bigger, faster, and stronger than we were. Species that tried to survive through caution went extinct. We learned that the only way to survive was to take risks that seemed suicidal to more cautious beings." The evolutionary argument was compelling, but it didn't fully explain the scope of human achievements since joining galactic civilization. They hadn't just survived their hostile environment. They had transcended the limitations that environment should have imposed. "Captain Shun, how do you explain human technological advancement rates that exceed galactic norms by orders of magnitude?" "We don't see technology as separate from psychology. When you believe that any problem can be solved if you're willing to pay the price, you start looking for solutions that more cautious species won't consider." Dr. Zuaextra added supporting data to the display. "Human research methods involve levels of experimentation that other species consider unethically dangerous. They test solutions under conditions that we would classify as potentially catastrophic, such as testing faster-than-light communication systems inside active black holes, such as experimenting with consciousness transfer in the corona of stars, such as attempting to terraform worlds by redirecting asteroid impacts." The list of human projects read like a catalog of theoretical impossibilities that had somehow become practical realities. Each achievement had required accepting risks that other species had calculated as unacceptable. Yet human civilization continued to flourish and expand at unprecedented rates. "Dr. Dwaxthara, you mentioned that human psychological patterns are proving contagious. Can you explain this phenomenon?" "Species that work closely with humans begin to adopt human approaches to problem solving. The Centaurian engineering teams working on joint projects with humans have started accepting risk levels that were previously unthinkable for their species." "With what results?" "Breakthrough achievements in fields that have been stagnant for centuries. The joint human-Centaurian shipyard that was constructed inside a supernova's stellar envelope is producing vessels with capabilities that we had believed were physically impossible." Representative Mordun of the Volcaran Republic raised a concern that had been troubling many delegates. "Dr. Zwaxthara, are we witnessing the emergence of a form of consciousness that will make existing approaches to civilization obsolete?" The question struck at the heart of galactic anxieties about human expansion. If human psychology was genuinely superior for solving complex problems, what did that mean for civilizations that had spent millennia developing careful, rational approaches to advancement? Representative Mordun, we're witnessing the emergence of a complementary form of consciousness. Human psychology excels at breakthrough achievements, solving problems that have been considered unsolvable. But they still require the careful, systematic approaches that other species have developed to consolidate and build upon those breakthroughs. Captain Chen nodded agreement. "We're not trying to replace other approaches to civilization. We're trying to add new possibilities to what civilization can achieve." such as proving that species don't have to accept limitations just because those limitations seem natural, such as demonstrating that cooperation between different types of consciousness can achieve things that no single approach could accomplish alone. Dr. HFY presented the conference's most significant finding. Delegates, our research indicates that human psychology represents an evolutionary adaptation to environments where gradual progress is insufficient for survival. They have developed the ability to make quantum leaps in capability when facing existential challenges. And the implications for galactic civilization? The implications are that we may be entering an era where the greatest challenges facing our civilizations, resource scarcity, environmental degradation, territorial conflicts, technological stagnation, can be addressed through approaches that seemed impossible until humans proved they weren't. Ambassador Veltorin voiced the concern that many delegates shared. Dr. Vyaxara, are we facing a future where non-human approaches to civilization become obsolete? No, Ambassador. We're facing a future where those approaches become more valuable than ever, because someone will need to implement and maintain the solutions that human psychology makes possible. The research had revealed that human breakthroughs required careful integration with existing systems to become sustainable. The stellar engineering projects that humans initiated needed Altarian precision to maintain long-term stability. The terraforming techniques that humans developed required Centaurian defensive planning to protect against unforeseen complications. Captain Shun, what is humanity's vision for the future of galactic civilization? A future where every species contributes what they do best, where Altarian caution prevents human boldness from becoming recklessness, where Centaurian stability provides foundations for human innovation, where Vulcaran wisdom guides human energy toward constructive purposes. Dr. Axtara concluded her presentation with a finding that would reshape interstellar relations for generations to come. Delegates, humans are not dangerous because they're trying to conquer or replace other forms of consciousness. They're dangerous because they're proving that consciousness itself has barely begun to explore its own possibilities. Meaning that everything we thought we knew about what sapient beings can achieve may need to be reconsidered. Humans haven't just shown us new ways to solve problems. They've shown us that the boundaries between possible and impossible are more flexible than we believed. As the conference concluded, delegates carried back to their home systems a new understanding of humanity's place in galactic civilization. Humans weren't aliens who happened to be good at fighting. They were living proof that consciousness could transcend the limitations that other species had accepted as fundamental laws of existence. The cosmos had trembled when humans went to war, not because they were uniquely violent, but because they had weaponized hope itself, the unshakable belief that any challenge could be overcome if beings were willing to pay the necessary price. And now that weapon was being turned toward the greatest challenges facing galactic civilization: poverty, disease, environmental destruction, territorial conflict, and the fundamental question of what sapient beings could achieve when they refused to accept that anything was truly impossible. The age of careful, gradual progress was ending. The age of breakthrough civilization had begun, and at its heart was a species that had learned to rush toward impossibility until impossibility yielded to human determination. Dr. Zexarov filed her final report with a single recommendation: embrace the impossible, because humans had proved that impossible was just another word for hasn't been figured out yet. The cosmos would never be the same.